Hey, welcome to the Bible and today's culture. The subject today is the separation of government and the church. Now, this didn't all start up in 1947 when the Supreme Court ruled on Everson versus education on the subject of could the Bible be read and could prayers be made in the public classrooms. This goes back 3,500 years before that. Uh, David is an illustration of this subject. And here's his story. This is what happened with David. Put it into context. We're in a time period when Eli was the second to last judge in Israel. He was followed by Samuel. Then the people said they wanted a king, so Samuel appointed Saul as the king, and David followed him. So that's the period of this story. So during Eli's time, Israel was fighting with the Philistines, and they went into battle. They took along their good luck charm, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant had been built in the wilderness. It contained three things inside the chest. One of them was the two tablets with the Ten Commandments on it. One was Moses' staff. He performed many miracles with getting out of Egypt and in the desert. And another one was a jar that contained the manna that fed them during the 40 years. So it was kind of a memorial to the Exodus and the time in the desert. So they took it into battle and they lost the battle, and the Philistines stole the ark. They took it to their country and they put it into their temple and set it alongside. Now, this ark was like, well, you can see a picture of it there. It's not very big. It was wood and it was gold plated. But they set it next to a big stone statue, many feet high of their God. And strange things happened while they possessed the ark. And one morning they walked into the temple, and the Philistine god during the night had toppled over, hit the stone floor, and broken to pieces. And it certainly couldn't have been done by this little ark that didn't weigh that much. But many other things happened, and they decided that this ark was not a good thing to have in their country. So they decided to send it back to Israel. They loaded it on a cart and put two oxen in front of it, and they set it on the road heading towards Israel, and they whipped the oxen, and they took off. And actually, they took it all the way into Israel, and they stopped in front of a house of a Hebrew, and Abinadab, and they stopped in front of his house, and he didn't know what to do with this ark, and actually nobody knew what to do with it. It had been gone for 7 months. So he and his sons just took it into their house for safekeeping. It stayed there for 50 years, okay? All through the rest of Eli's time as a judge, through Samuel's time as a judge, through Saul's time as a king, and into David's time as a king. And finally David said, this is silly. I hear this ark is around and it's not in the tabernacle. We need to go get it. So he made it an event. He says, we're going to bring this back into Jerusalem. And so he sent invitations out to the wealthiest, most powerful people in Israel. Come join us for the party to bring the ark back into Jerusalem. He prepared a cart to put it on and brought some oxen. And he asked the sons of Abinadab to lead the parade. He had a band, instruments. It was party time. Everybody was dressed in their finest wear. The king was in his royal robes. And as they got a little ways down the road, they must have hit a pothole or something in the road, and the ark started to tip over, and one of the sons reached up to keep it from falling off the ark, and he touched it. You can see that's what's happening there. He's reaching out to touch it to make sure it doesn't fall off the ark. Well, he did off the cart, okay? He did that, and as he touched the ark, he died. Well, that really killed the party. Uh, David didn't know what happened, didn't know what to think. They stopped the party. They put the ark in the Hebrew house of the nearest farmer, and they left it there. So the problem was David didn't handle this thing right. Uh, Moses had said that all the kings, all the leaders of Israel, when they came into office, would have to write out a copy of the 5 books of Moses, which told them how their culture was supposed to function and how their religion was supposed to function. Evidently, David hadn't done that. I doubt anybody had done that. But they were supposed to know this. And the rules were that the ark was not to be on a cart. It was supposed to be carried on the poles. So you don't, here's the poles down here. They went on Levite shoulders, priests' shoulders, and they carried it. Their the parade was supposed to be led by the priests. So David went back to Jerusalem, and after a few months, he figured out. He must have gone in and read Moses' writings. He figured out what he had done wrong. So then he set up a new plan to bring the ark back into Jerusalem. So he invited the Levites to come in, and they're the people in white carrying the poles of the ark. The only instruments there were the trumpets that the priests used in the temple. And so it wasn't a band, it was just the priestly trumpets. And instead of inviting the royalty to come, he invited the whole nation. Everybody came to bring the ark back in. This God was not a God of the government. It was a God of the people, and it was a God of their faith. So this is what happened. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle. Then he, David, distributed amongst all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both the women and the men, to everyone. He distributed a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, everyone to his own house. That was not a royal feast, okay? That was a very simple picnic. When David showed up for this thing, this time he did not show up in his royal garb. He actually wrapped a towel around his waist. And he was a simple person who was joining the public. The point of this is, God didn't get mad at the Philistines who set it on an ark. They didn't know the difference. He didn't get mad at Abinadab's sons who picked it up and brought it into their house. They didn't know any difference. The people who should know the difference were the leaders of Israel. And David should have known that's not how this is to be done. Why? Because the king is not in charge of their faith. Okay? God's in charge of the faith. The priests, the prophets are in charge of the faith. The king does not take over for the church. This is the first example of God saying there is a separation between government and the church. And we're going to get more and more into that. This illustration tells you what it's about. So here's a history of the government and the church, of the state and the church being in conflict. You remember Henry VIII, right? King of England. He was married. He wanted to have a son. He went through 7 wives to get it. So he was in the midst of one marriage that wasn't producing a son for him. So he wrote to the Pope, because England was Catholic at that point, and said, I need a divorce decree. The Pope wouldn't give it to him. So Henry said, well, I'll take care of that. He canceled the Catholic Church in England, and he started the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is basically the same as the Catholic Church. Same priest, same process, same mass, same everything. Is probably different now from Henry's day, but it just changed the name on the front of the churches. But the difference was the people running the church knew who their boss was. When the Catholic Church was in town, the boss was the Pope. Now the boss is the king. And when Henry said, I want a divorce, he got it. And he was able to marry his next wife. That's what happens when there isn't a separation between the church and the state. This happened with Hitler. Hitler took over Germany. And all of the pastors of the German churches knew that if they didn't succumb to Hitler, they'd lose their jobs. They wouldn't be able to hold churches. So they didn't oppose Hitler in any of the things that he did. We know how terrible they were. One person did. That was Bonhoeffer. He stood up to Hitler. And shortly before the end of World War II, Hitler executed him. The clash that comes when there's not a separation between church and the state is happening today with Putin. Putin is waging a war in Ukraine. Both of them are Orthodox churches. And the Orthodox priests in Ukraine are shocked that the chief priests in Moscow are going on public radio and television supporting Putin for his war. How can they be doing this? Well, they know who calls the shots in Moscow. It's Putin, and they're succumbing to it, and Ukraine is paying for it. So here's an example of a relationship between the church leaders and the state that worked the way it should. It's between David and Nathan. So David had had an affair with Bathsheba. And to cover up his affair and to be able to marry her, he put her husband in war in a dangerous position and he was killed. David knew that would happen. And then he married Bathsheba. Nathan was now the prophet in Israel. He followed Samuel. And Nathan's duty was to God. He wasn't put in place by Daniel. He walked into Daniel's palace and he said, I'll tell you what you've done. And he told a story that illustrated what he had done with Bathsheba and her husband. And he says, you're wrong. David said, you're right. I am wrong. And he repented. Because Nathan knew one of the roles of the church is to be the conscience of a nation. And he executed that. Here's another story. Dick Nixon and Billy Graham. Billy Graham was the lead pastor in America. Everybody knew Billy Graham. And traditionally, he came and met every new president when he came into office, starting with Dwight Eisenhower. His purpose for being there was two things. To tell him that he was going to pray for him and his work, and that he would be a good leader for our country. But to remind him that his duty was to execute his office with morality and ethics. But later in Billy Graham's life, he confessed that he didn't do that to Nixon. He got swept up in the Nixon system, and he never confronted Nixon. What would have happened if Billy Graham would have faced Nixon down in his office and said, what you're doing is wrong? What a difference that might have made to our country. Billy Graham, at that point, was not the conscience of our nation that we needed him to be. Martin Luther King knew his role. His role was to challenge the country on the issue of civil rights. And he spoke about it diligently. Some of his best messages were on this. He told what he thought God wanted to have happen to his people, and we know all about his address in Washington, D.C. The difference is that the government and the church function differently and are in tension with one another. And it should be that way. The government is elected by the people. Their boss is the populace. And they represent the people and are supposed to execute justice. The church is the opposite. The church functions from the top down. Church leaders are appointed by God and by the leadership of the church. The church represents God, truth, and grace. Often church leaders are elected by the congregation. Sometimes it becomes confusing as to who the boss is. There becomes a tension as to whether a church leader is going to challenge the congregation on something that they don't really want to be challenged on. But the congregation is their boss. They elected him in, they can elect him out. So whether the subject is abortion or police violence, we tend to overlook it because it's very uncomfortable for the audience, and they may not speak on it. So this is how it works. The government has the power of the law. Okay? The church has the power of grace and truth and forgiveness. So this is how it happens. A policeman comes up behind us. His lights go on, his siren goes on. He stops us, he walks up to our window, and he says, "You're going 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. Here's your ticket. Go see the judge." The church handles forgiveness and second chances, and they define what justice is. But the policeman doesn't handle forgiveness. He doesn't walk up to your car and says, "I haven't ever seen you in trouble before. You must be a really good person, and this must have been a mistake. I forgive you. Give me that ticket back. You're off scot-free." That's not his job. But the church, Jesus told it, how many times do you forgive somebody? 70 times 7. So we have this tension between someone who is applying the law and someone else who is applying God's grace and forgiveness. We need both of them, but we don't need both of them in the same person. All right? That's the policeman's job. When the policeman is at church, he functions under grace, truth, and forgiveness. When he's in his uniform, he functions under accountability and justice. One more example of a king in Israel that ran into a conflict with the religious leaders. His name is Uzziah, and he tries to act as a priest. So this is from 2 Chronicles. But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led him to his downfall. He was really a pretty good king until this point in his life. He entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest, with 80 other courageous priests of the Lord, followed him in. They're challenging the king. That's their job as the conscience of Israel. They confronted the king and said, "It is not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord." Uzziah, the king, who had a censer in his hand, ready to burn incense, became angry. While he was raging at the priest in their presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house. He had to be quarantined as a leper. He lived there leprous and excluded from the temple of the Lord. He had broken God's rule of the separation of church and state. Israel set up a Supreme Court. And when Moses wrote this, he says, "If any cases come before your courts that are too difficult, and I'm dead, then you go to the priest, who are Levites, and to the judge who is in office at that time. Why the priests? They were the constitutional experts. They were the one that practically had memorized the first five books of the Bible, and how God wanted their culture to be run, and how God wanted the government to be run. But they didn't make the decision. The judge listened to them about the rules, the Constitution, and the judge decided whether they were innocent and guilty and what the punishment would be. The judge represented people. The priest represents God and his commandments. The judge represents the people and executes justice. So the church and the government need to always be separate. The church being the conscience, the state being the executor of justice. Here's some questions for you. Read them, discuss them. When you're through, I hope you take a look at this one-page history that you get to read called Squanto and the Pilgrims. And then the following week, we are going to do stories of leaders who understood the government domain. So there's going to be a whole list of people who have understood what God meant about government, and they executed it, and be examples for us on doing it the right way. So enjoy doing your discussion, your questions, and we'll see you next class. Thanks.